save it for posterity. All right. Yeah. All right. So welcome you all to our March edition of the APCG online colloquium. We are discussing Sarai-Anne Ikenze's paper today on exploring the role of neo-colonial interest in IMF structural adjustment policies. We are very lucky today to have Robin Harden, who is an associate professor at the Oxford University, and Thomas Stubbs at Royal Holloway University, providing commentary, providing some feedback to Sarai's work. The way this goes is that we will give Sarai an opportunity to tell us a bit about the work that she's doing, the kinds of feedback that she wants from all of us, and then we will give Robin and Thomas about 15 minutes each to provide feedback to Sarai, and then we will open it to all of us to provide feedback to Sarai. So without much ado, I would ask Sarai to tell us a bit about your project and what do you expect from us today. And thank you all very much for joining us as well.
You, George. And yes, first of all, thank you all for coming, and thank you especially to Robin and Thomas for taking the time to read the paper. I don't have a lot to say in terms of context, other than that it might be helpful to know a little bit about where this paper came from. So I'm a PhD student, and I've been working for the last few years on a dissertation on sectoral policy choices more broadly, and essentially when and why we see cases of sectoral continuity, and particularly primary sector continuity in sub-Saharan African countries. And this, I wrote this paper as kind of a side project or a side paper very early in my PhD process, just using some of the data that I had collected for my dissertation, for my broader dissertation. And so now that I'm wrapping up the dissertation, and I wanted to just come back to this paper and see really, one, whether it even is something worth kind of pursuing for publication, and then if so, whether the kind of some of the ways in which I can make it that I can work with it in order to make it publishable. So I suppose that's the kind of feedback I'm looking for today. And I think that's really all I have to say.
Okay, great. Shall we start with you, Robin? Either of you can go first. Just see it, from my screen, I can see.
Sure, I'm happy to. And that way, if we have the same comments, I get to make them first, which is easier for me. Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to do this, and thank you, Sarai-Anne, for this paper. I really enjoyed reading this. Let me say the first thing I want to say, and I know this, I don't want this to sound trite, but the paper was really nicely written. It was really clear and readable, and both of those things are important, and I think often undervalued. It made my job a lot easier. So first of all, thank you for that aspect of this. So this paper addresses an interesting and I think important question, which essentially is, were IMF structural adjustment programs in sub-Saharan Africa a neo-colonial continuation of extractive colonial development strategies? And so in the discussion of the background literature on this, I think it's not an area that I work on, so it was very nice for me to get a good introduction to this. And I thought you do a nice job. It's very thorough, and you highlight the research gap really clearly and motivate the study really well. I think this question is a very difficult one, and in some ways quite an ambitious one to tackle. I think it's hard enough to try and establish the effects of programs or policies. But what you're doing here, your goal here is kind of, I think, even more difficult, which is to establish, as I read it, the the motivations or intentions behind these kinds of policies. And that's really difficult because these are essentially unobservable. And I don't say that as a criticism. I think it's actually really commendable that you take on that kind of a difficult question. But it just kind of, I say it to highlight some of the challenges that come in this, because this comes through, so I think, some of the things that you might work on in this paper, I think, relate to the fact that what you're trying to do is particularly difficult here. So at the end of this section where you lay out the background research and the theory, you derive this key hypothesis, which is that if structural adjustment programs were a continuation of extractive colonial policies, then we should see a similar focus of policy on the different productive sectors that you look at across these two periods, the colonial period and then the structural adjustment program period. And so you note in that section that this is based on an assumption that if neo-colonialism was a factor in the design of structural adjustment programs, then the optimal strategies to maximize the economic benefit to Western states will be similar across these two periods, right? And so I don't think that's unreasonable, but I wondered, one thing I think you could push on a little bit is to consider relaxing that assumption and what would happen if you do. So if structural adjustment programs were neo-colonial in the sense that they're designed to pursue the interests of Western states by maintaining or reclaiming control of post-colonial Africa, but if the strategies for doing that changes over time, then we might not see a similar focus on these different sectoral policies across the periods, even if they are neo-colonial, right? And so you hint at this in the conclusion, so you're aware of it, but I wonder if, just to develop the theoretical argument further, and maybe then also to generate some additional testable implications, you might consider this more in the paper and just kind of push on what would happen if you relax that assumption and think more about the nature of Western interests and the optimal strategies for pursuing them in the latter period, and how that might then change the expectations. So I think that could be one way that you could kind of get another way of looking at this, kind of testing this argument here. So in the paper, you detail very carefully the data generation process here. And that process seems to have been extensive and very impressive, right? You draw on lots of these original sources and do a really nice job of getting this data source out of them. There are some limitations to that data, and you're upfront about them in the paper, and that's really good that you're aware of them and discuss them. I think you could do a little bit more going forward to discuss those limitations and think about some of the implications. So I think that's one area that you could work on for this paper. So you highlight, I think, the key issue here, which is that you have a difference in the type and structure of data that's available across these two periods, right? And that's just a kind of something you can't do anything about. The data is what the data is. And I think you work well with what's available. But the key difference is that the colonial era sources focus more, as I read it, on the outputs in a sense, while the IMF sources give you more information on the kind of inputs or the strategies from these IFIs. And so I guess I'd push you to think a little bit more about the potential implications of those differences for the data that you draw, and then how those implications might be overcome or at least checked against, right? So one possibility that I thought of would be that if you focus only on the aspects of the data that is more comparable, you could then see whether it makes a difference to the conclusions that you draw. So if there's limited information on the kind of plans or strategies in the colonial sources, then what would happen to the data that you generate if you code the colonial sources or code both sources just on the outputs in both periods, right? If you've got much more data on outputs for the earlier period, then if you only look at outputs, does that change the comparison you get across them? This isn't ideal, because if we go back to the kind of goal here of measuring and comparing motivations or intentions, this is kind of further away from that than this information on plans and strategies. But it would at least provide for a more directly like-for-like comparison across the two periods. And then it could give an indication of the extent to which the differences in sources are driving the results that you get. So it might just be a useful way to kind of check what's going on in the data there. Another challenge with this type of data generating process is with the reliability of coding here. And you do a really good job of discussing and detailing the coding process and then illustrating with these nice examples. So I think that's done really well, and that gives more confidence in the way that it's designed and implemented here. But as a suggestion for how you might deal more with any of those potential concerns, I wondered if you might consider a secondary coding of all or a sample of the data here to get someone else, maybe a research assistant, to recode some of this data to allow you to do some checks for intercoder reliability and see whether you'd get variation in the data based on that. I know that's kind of asking a lot because obviously it's resource intensive to have someone else do that. But if there's some way of you doing that, it would, I think, provide a bit more confidence in the validity of the key measures that you look at. And then another option would be to consider forms of computational text analyses on these original sources. If you have all of the initial text, then you could think of ways to do that that would allow you to evaluate the salience of the different sectoral focus in the different countries over the different periods. So that might be another way of doing this that wouldn't rely on having someone else code these. A couple more points on the data, just smaller ones. So you focus here, the data focuses on former British colonies. And I think that seems reasonable given the data that you have and makes it more comparable. I wondered if in the paper you can consider the extent to which you would actually expect to see differences across countries that were colonized by the French, Belgian, and Portuguese. And that might enable you to say something systematic about any scope conditions that we might place on the results that you get. And then the last point on the data, I wondered if you've considered any potential variation that might occur during the period that's covered for the structural adjustment programs. So the period that you look at there runs from 1986 to 1999. And there's quite a significant change in the world in the kind of middle of that period that may have altered Western interests and influenced the optimal strategies for pursuing those interests during that period. And looking at the data that you have, this seems to be somewhat reflected in the changes to the direction of the trends in the focus on extractive and industrial sectors that kicks in the early 90s. So I wondered if that's something you can consider and explore a bit more in the data. And then finally, let me just say a little bit about the results and your discussion of them. So I think it's really nicely presented and it's very clear and thorough in the way that you go through the results. I really like figures 1 and 3 that you use for kind of clarifying the theoretical expectations. And they're nice because they then enable a clear evaluation of the findings you get against those expectations. So I think that's nice the way that you do those. And it makes sense to have both of these different figures, given that you present the results at the aggregate level as trends and then at the country level as kind of points in this way. One thing that I thought in reading this, it feels slightly repetitive, but when you set up those two in the aggregate and then the country level, because in a way it seems to be saying kind of the same or a very similar thing in two different ways here. And it makes sense that you do this because of the difference between the trends and the points at the country level. But I wondered if there's a way that you could kind of integrate those two discussions to try and avoid that, and still perhaps show both of those figures, but kind of say the same thing, but at the same time say at the aggregate level and the country level, we'd expect it to look like this. I think in the results, you do a nice job of showing essentially the continuity and change in the structures of these 10 countries' economies over this time period. And the interpretation of the results seems very reasonable here. But the challenge, and this goes back to the point I made at the beginning, is kind of inferring the intentions or motivations underlying the policies here. And again, this is something you acknowledge in the conclusion. You talk about other work that you could do to get at that. And so you mentioned doing kind of detailed case studies, and I think that might be a really effective way to get at this through qualitative research and maybe even interviews with former policymakers themselves that might give you more insights into the motivations to underline the policies here. You also mentioned doing quantitative causal analysis, and I was trying to think of ways that you might do this effectively to answer the questions that you have. And nothing effectively jumped to my mind here, but one option that I thought, if you want to investigate the kind of impact of these policies, might be to use the synthetic control method. But the challenge here, I think, might be that so many cases actually are exposed to structural adjustment programs during this period. So finding kind of enough cases to build a kind of effective synthetic control here is going to be challenging. But it might be something to look at, just to explore as a possibility. And then I think the other challenge again is kind of separating the outcomes from the inputs here. So one way to kind of interpret the overall pattern of the results that you see is that over this long time period, from like the 1920s through to the end of the century, essentially we see very limited change in the structure of what are predominantly agrarian economies, with some decline in extractive focus and some increase in industrial focus in certain cases, right? And then the challenge here is to try and kind of infer the extent to which these outcomes result from inputs or policies that affect them. And in thinking about this and discussing this and explaining it, I wonder if you might also, so you consider these kind of external policy interventions, but I wonder if you might also bring in a consideration of the impact and agency of African states as part of the explanation here. So reading this brought to mind a chapter by Thandika Makanda that I read recently. I don't know if you know it, it's a chapter called State Capacity, History, Structure, and Political Contestation in Africa. I can send you my notes, and if you don't have the reference, it'll be in there. But it's one of the nice things he does in that chapter is consider variation in state capacity across Africa, and then seeks to identify some of the structural and political factors that account for this variation. And so one of the things he talks about is distinction in forms of colonial incorporation across different countries, and in particular between cash crop and labor reserve economies, which has implications for extractive taxation capacity. And the cases you have fall neatly kind of half and half between these two different types. So I wonder if you can think about the variation that you have in the data here and think about whether that might be underlying any of the changes that you see in the kind of the structure of these economies over this period, and whether that can be any part of the explanation. I think that there's a broader point that it may be worth considering some of the historical and contextual differences across the countries that you look at as factors that might influence the development and transformation of these economies over this period outside of these other policy interventions. Okay, but overall, I think it's really nice work, and I really enjoyed reading it. And I think there is potential in what you have to do something very effective with it. So I would push you to not to discard it, but definitely to kind of to continue working with it and develop it. Thanks.
Thanks, Robin. Thomas?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So I'll just start by just riffing off Robin a bit and then get to my comments. So I agreed that this was very clearly written, and as a reader, I very much appreciated it. It was easy to read in a very good way. And the presentation of results was very nice. I also like the hypothetical versus actual situation that you had with the figures, and then the the aggregate versus the country specific points. I thought maybe you could avoid repetition by focusing on kind of, you have the absolute and relative measures, maybe focus on one and dump the other in the appendix or something like this. So I'll just go, and the other point I thought Robin made, which I understand in the comments I'm about to say, is the point he made about the agency of African states. I'll make that point in relation to what the argument you might expect from the IMF responding to your paper, which is, hey buddy, this is a negotiation, this isn't an imposition. And that's perhaps more accurate now, less accurate in the period you're looking at. Anyway, I'll go through some of my points. So just my understanding of it, the manuscript sets out to examine whether structural adjustment programs are a neo-colonial continuation of the extractive colonial development strategies, testing quantifiable similarities between the agricultural, extractive and industrial policies across the 10 British colonies across two periods, the 1920 to 40 period and 1986 to 1999. I thought a key contribution here was this data set of sectoral focus I thought it was a very impressive contribution, and it seems I've put here, which will be useful well beyond the immediate scope of this study. And it sounds what you're saying about your PhD, that indeed you're finding a lot of use for it, and that certainly doesn't surprise me. So pretty fantastic effort, I would say. My comments are kind of broad-based, less so focusing on the data, and in some senses a devil's advocate in part because you know, I'm imagining what defenders of the IMF might say, and part of me saying this is kind of, these are similar criticisms I've had to fend off too. So it's kind of going through that avenue. So the first thing, I've got 4 main points, and the first point is, can what the IMF is doing be characterized as neo-colonial, this kind of broad point? And there's a couple of points I think to consider when you theorize this. First is, so this is 3 sub-points under this. The first is a neo-colonial continuation, to me, implies a sense of intent. So is the IMF purposely trying to exploit sub-Saharan Africa for resources? For this, it may be worth considering Ha-Joon Chang's thoughts in his trade e-book, Bad Samaritans, as to whether these organizations, the IMF and World Bank, have ill will or faulty ideology. My sense from IMF discussions, policy papers and research notes, and this is different from management, is the latter. They have kind of faulty ideology rather than ill will. Does this make it any less neo-colonial if it is not the intent but the effect all the same? Maybe or maybe not. I could be convinced either way, but I think the manuscript could consider that. The second sub-point under this first thing is, you know, this is the common criticism you get with IMF-related studies is, unlike colonialism, a country's government selects into an IMF program and is always free to walk away, whereas community leaders, in most cases, did not select into colonialism. There is, of course, a question of to what extent the government really represents the people, and therefore whether you can say a country has truly selected into it. But is this something other than colonialism if it is African governments selecting into it, even if they are not representing the will of the people? Of course, the alternative to selecting into the IMF is often a default, which can be even more damaging for the people. So it may not really be a choice in that sense. But regardless, I think these points could be brought out in the manuscript. And the third sub-point here is, while I sympathize with this broad kind of neo-imperial, neo-colonial argument, framing it, I think, as a continuation of colonialism understates key differences. And you do touch on this point in a paragraph in the conclusions, and I thought maybe some foregrounding might help. So in a sense, this is, you know, 1920 to 40 versus 1986 to 99, a completely different context, and they may employ completely different strategies to fulfill the functions of colonial relationships. Or in short, I would not expect the same kinds of policies given the different time frame, but I would expect that they serve the same purpose, and that is kind of, in the Marxian sense, surplus extraction. So you could theorize more this notion of the surface colonial policies versus the underlying colonial structural dynamic in section 2. This also may have implications for how you operationalize your arguments, and why I think you find only limited evidence of neo-colonial focus in the structural adjustment period. For example, export processing zones and investment-friendly legislation for manufacturing would, I understand from your coding, be industrial sector, and might in your framework be construed as not colonial. But other authors have said things like tax breaks to transnational corporations through such schemes are actually a form of neo-colonial strategy or neo-imperialism. So again, that implies some potentially theorizing it, but also maybe some operational implications. The second key point of the 4 I've got here is, and one that Robin also touched on, is the IMF itself has evolved in the way it lent and negotiated with countries between 1986 and 1999, and this may influence the extent to which it can be characterized as neo-colonial. And you do trace this somewhat in your paper. In the early 1980s, lending countries had more development space because the conditions attached to the programs were always quantitative, giving countries freedom as to how to hit the targets. And they primarily only pertain to stabilization measures. And then from the mid-1980s, where you capture it, structural conditions were introduced, entailing deregulation, liberalization, privatization measures. But it starts with a trickle. And by the mid-1990s, I mean, it's all guns blazing. So there is a clear change. It's not flat the whole way. It's one or two structural conditions into fully fledged. What is the size of the bread loaf in Egypt, for example? That's genuinely a condition. So, you know, it's evolving. And by the end of the period you're covering, there was a greater emphasis on ensuring recipient countries had flexibility and ownership, as well as bringing in good governance and rule of law conditions. So, you know, this is important because the IMF might respond to your paper and say, hey, it's a negotiation, not an imposition. We design conditions based on the government's domestic priorities. My sense is that in the period you've covered, it is more of an imposition, although, and only after 2000s, it kind of changed quite a bit. So it may not undermine your argument, but I think you perhaps need to kind of expand on that a bit to preempt those kinds of criticisms. The third point is third broad point is the paper perhaps could be strengthened by engaging with alternative hypotheses that might also explain the empirical findings of this persistent focus on the agricultural sector, here perceived as evidence of neocolonialism, or at least one facet of evidence. And the first sub-point here, I think, is the role of ideas, and in particular, the ideological rise of neoliberal ideas, culminating in the World Bank's Berg report in 1981 on accelerated development in sub-Saharan Africa. This conceived development problems as a result of non-adherence to free market policies, and prominently featured were the overhaul of agricultural marketing boards, which is relevant to kind of agriculture here, in order to improve the efficiency and competitiveness of subsectors that were engaging in global markets, or because they were seen as having comparative advantage in the Ricardian sense in such areas due to climate and compared to Asia, less readily available labour supply. And in this sense, these policies, the intent was not about extraction, but rather actually improving development, because there was a genuine sense that this would allow African countries to become like the West rather than subordinate to the West. So my sense is that if you follow the kind of the rise of neoliberal ideas, it blurs the intent and looks more like faulty ideology rather than scumbaggery. So it's just something to consider. The second one is another plausible explanation for your result. I've put here the institutionalist or path dependence explanation. And that is, given that the infrastructure, human capacity, and global networks were already established in those particular agricultural sectors, it made sense to just continue pursuing a growth strategy in those sectors or subsectors. And it may have been much more costly to reverse, to try and change. You know, that difficulty of reversal, both economically speaking, because the economic infrastructure knowledge is already there, but also politically, because you now have vested interest by powerful business and political elites for certain subsectors to remain salient within that domestic political economy. So to me, this is a much more mundane explanation than neo-colonialism. But even though these institutions we know are probably a consequence of the neo-colonial institutions being set up and path dependence from this. So yes, there is still a neo-colonial influence, because the path dependence is from kind of the institutions set up often by the colonial kind of force. But what I'm saying is, and now to the present, it's a stickiness of these institutions, which means that it may be economically and politically more efficient to continue to pursue avenues in the agricultural sector or in already globally successful sectors. Quite simply, it's the easier short-term option. And when you're dealing with the IMF, you're dealing with primarily balance of payments issues, and they're looking at a short-term horizon. So the final fourth point is, given that neo-colonialism doesn't explain all your findings, my question is there a framework that does? Is there possibility to innovate in that regard? And for example, you have this colonial quadrant that you map out in those figures Robin was talking about. And I wondered whether there was potential to theorize some of the other quadrants and give them kind of a typology, like developmental neocolonialism, or I don't know. I was just kind of riffing off, maybe there's something of that ilk. Those are my four main comments. I have some minor ones which I've written down, but I can send them to you afterwards. They're much more minor. So overall, I really enjoyed reading this paper. And as I said, a lot, I do agree with the broad I'm sympathetic to the argument of kind of the neo-colonial and implementation. I think it's more considering some of the alternatives and bringing more nuance to the sense of neo-colonialism, potentially how it looks slightly different compared to the 1920s and 40s. But overall, really well done. And that's my key points. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, and thanks, Robin, again for those very well thought through and extensive comments. I hope that please do send them over to Sarai at the end so that she has a written version of it. Sarai, do you want to get some follow-ups? Do you want to ask Robin or Thomas any questions regarding what they have said before we open it up?
No, I don't think so. These are all really, really good suggestions. They're all things I think that are doable, that are reasonable to do, and that I think are really good suggestions for addressing some of the issues that I have been kind of particularly worried about or thinking about with the paper. So thank you both.
Okay. Then I guess I will open it up now and take your hands. If you have any comments, you can just use the raise hand button, or you can just write your name on the chat and I will call it out. So Amanda.
It's actually just a suggestion, but I wanted to echo really quickly how impressed I was with the paper. It's not an area that I know a lot about beyond just kind of vague notions and stuff I read in grad school, but I really enjoyed reading it. It's and I learned a lot from it. So I think it definitely has publishable potential. And like the other said, it's really well written, which is something that's hard to learn how to do. So it's great as a skill set. So my suggestion was just, I recently came across a paper that I think is a working paper and not yet published, but I wanted to just note it for you. It's by Belinda Archibong, who's an economist, I think at Bernard. And it's a working paper that argues that some of these structural adjustment programs have had positive economic returns in the longer run. And so it's a little bit counter to basically most of what I've read about this. And so it seems like if it's a working paper that's circulating and people are aware of it, might be something useful to engage in. It looked from my reading that a lot of the positive economic consequences were really making up for the really sluggish growth right after the policies were implemented rather than actually value added economic growth. But still, it seems like something you might want to engage with in the sense that there seems to be ongoing debate about the implications of these policies. And then for what it's worth, maybe just my main reaction was similar to something that Thomas just said at the end, kind of thinking through other reasons why we might see this dependence on agriculture that doesn't have anything to do with international policy interventions, either in the colonial era or after. So it seems like one of the things you'll really have to take on. And thanks for sharing the paper.
Yes, thank you for this. I'll take a look at this paper. And maybe I should say that I definitely, as far as other reasons, I focus quite a bit on these kinds of other reasons like economic ideas and structural conditions and things in the dissertation. So I can and should bring them into the paper itself.
Sarah?
Yeah, hi. Hi, Sarai. Thank you for sharing your paper. I thought I will echo everyone else to say that it was really well written and really interesting. And that's always nice. It's always a pleasant surprise. Yeah, I thought it was really a really kind of fascinating way to look at structural adjustment anew, right? Because there's obviously been a lot of work done on it before. And so I'm coming in as someone who studies health, so I am biased, but I'm wondering if you might talk, I mean, I don't know what your fuller dissertation was about, and you very obviously focused on kind of like agriculture, industrialization and, the extractive sectors, which I think is absolutely fine. But of course, I'm always thinking about also the impact of structural adjustment on like the social sectors as well, education and health, and other sectors that kind of have less of that kind of like strategic importance thinking behind them. And this, I'm not suggesting that you necessarily have to like add this to your paper, and you certainly like probably don't have the data for it, or I don't even know how you would get data of that kind to measure these sorts of things. But it might be a nice thing to kind of compare some of your findings to other work that's been done that talks more specifically about these other sectors, right? Because specifically because you took a sectoral approach, structural adjustment decimated all of the sectors, right? Not just certain ones. And so it might be interesting to kind of even do like a thought experiment, maybe in a discussion section, right? At the end, about how you might think about sectors beyond the ones that you specifically have data for or looked at in your paper, and what this might say more broadly about your theory, right? And because I think it goes beyond these sectors, even though of course these sectors are really illustrative for the purposes, if that makes sense. So that was just my little 2 cents. Thank you.
Should I respond, George?
Yeah, you can. Yes, please.
Yes. Thank you, Sarah. You're right. You're absolutely right. And actually, I early on made the choice to exclude health and and education and other sectors, even though they're really kind of central to the policy frameworks in structural adjustment, because I was interested in these kind of strategic sectors. But I think that it would be really interesting to think about how this then what this would imply, these kinds of theories would imply then for these non-strategic sectors. So yeah, I'll definitely think about it when revising the paper.
Sarah?
Is that me this time?
Yes.
Thanks, sorry. Wasn't sure if anyone else had hands up. Thanks very much. So apologies. I'm sorry. I have not read the paper anywhere near as carefully as I should have. But yeah, I was intrigued by it, which is why I joined, because I was and I like this sort of a forum as well. And a number of the thoughts I had have already been brought up by the other readers. One thing I wondered about, though, and this is at the risk of horribly complicating things, and probably not suggesting you actually do this, but the sort of counterfactual, or the sort of what was the word somebody used earlier? The kind of, if I was reading it as a critical reader, what would a critical reader say? Was to wonder, is it possible to look at the policies of these countries in the intervening period? In other words, we've got the colonial policy, we've got the policies that you're arguing, or that some would argue, are shaped by the IFIs and structural adjustment programs. But these countries also had independent policies in between. And so inevitably in reading this and about SAP, because my original research in Zimbabwe was very much looking at the implementation of SAP there, or ESAP as it was called. So it's going a long way back, but it's still the case I know rather too well. There wasn't a huge amount of change in policies in some ways. The Zimbabwean government had always been very export crop focused. It also did a whole bunch of things that massively improved peasant production. but it was always focused on exports. Now, where we did see a major shift there was in the scope for the industrial sector, which of course had been very much expanded under the Rhodesian government, kind of after Europe, in the 70s roughly. So anyway, I guess as a bit of a thought experiment, what struck me is we're going to think about agency, which I think is absolutely important here, because I do think it plays a bigger account than is often given credit for. I think often the IFIs take on all the blame, more blame than they necessarily should. That's not to exculpate them, but to suggest that the countries need to. Anyway, it just seemed to me that actually, is there a shift in their policies? And that then, it probably complicates things too much, but I'd love to see that data factored in there. So apologies for just complicating things, but the good thing about it is that the paper really made me think, and that's what you want in an interesting paper to read. So I think that's a good sign.
Thank you. I think it's a good complication, actually. And originally, the plan was to have continuous data from the colonial period through structural adjustment. I encountered some issues, particularly with COVID, getting access to the independence period, data for the independence period. But it is, at least for some of these countries, it is available in physical archives. So it would be possible to get it and code it at some point if I wanted to, or at least even just qualitatively describe what some of these countries were doing in the interim period. So thank you. It's a good suggestion.
So if I may insert myself in on the list. So just to re-echo what others have said, I think this was really well written and very clearly laid out, and I really enjoyed reading it as well. Not an area I'm an expert on, but also enjoyed thinking through. I like this sort of the ambition of the paper of trying to look at things in the pre-colonial period and post-colonial period and try to compare the two things. But I think, like Robin, I was struggling with the comparability of the actors involved in these two periods. I think in some way you might want to make a broader and take my comment as someone who has no idea in this area of work, but you might want to consider how, in spite of changes in the constraints that that these actors, if you want to box all of them into this neo-colonial colonial actors, so to speak, in the pre-colonial and post-colonial period, irrespective of the changes in the constraints. So during the pre-colonial period, they could be, implementing these policies without any big constraints in the countries that they were operating in, compared to the 1980s down the line, where you have, popular governments emerging out, and you have the SAP, and the continuity that emerged appears quite puzzling, that it happened that way, that governments still, the policies still continue to be the same. And it will be interesting to bring out that idea more, although the actors seems not comparable and the constraints may have changed. The continuity is somewhat puzzling to me upon reading the paper. I also thought that the scheme that you provided in terms of figure 1 to sort of lay out the theoretical expectation, I thought I would have loved it to have come earlier, so that the results section would just have spoken to the expectation, rather than mash them together at the results section, because I thought that was really nice, and I think you really do a good job trying to say that this is, we only think about one quadrant or one expectation when it comes to the focus of these policies over time, whether they are decreasing or increasing. But we can think of all these aspects in different sectors. And if you can set that expectation out earlier on, that will make I think that would make the contribution even come out more just from the early part of the paper. But otherwise, I thought this was really nice, and I look forward to reading more of it. So we still have, 10 more minutes, and reactions, comments from either Sarai or any of us is still welcome. So Thomas and Robin, do you have like suggestions as to where this paper can be targeted? If all your comments are implemented.
So no, I think I don't have a suggestion, but I think in part because it's a topic that's a bit far away from what I work on, so I don't know I don't know exactly the lie of the land and work in this area, and it depends, I think, on which of these things you're able to do and how far you want to develop the paper. Whether you go down the road of kind of seeking to explain more of this variation across countries and looking to broaden that out, or pushing more on the kind of what are different ways in which, if it's neo-colonialism, could that be manifested? And then, so I think there are kind of different avenues. And I think actually, as a paper, you can't really do all of them, right? So I think in a way, you need to think about which bits of these you're going to do and which you're not, and then that will shape what the paper looks like. And then I think that might kind of determine where you would seek to land it. If that's a way of me saying, of justifying not having a good suggestion here. But also maybe a good thing to say that I wouldn't expect you to do all of these things in one paper, but I do think there are useful things to do in terms of kind of pushing on the data and overcoming any kind of reservations that people may have on that. And then in kind of building up this explanation more and thinking more about how that would go. One other thing, and again, people who work more on this area might know better than me, but I always remember the Nick van der Waals work and how he highlights big variations in implementation of reforms across countries during the period of structural adjustment. And I don't know whether more has been done on that or whether there's good data on that, but it strikes me that that might play a part here in thinking about the extent to which countries do kind of who take on board structural adjustment programs actually implement these policies, because that will affect the extent to which the outcomes you observe are the result of these policies themselves. So that might be another thing to consider. Yeah.
Monte.
Thank you very much. Monty McMurtry, calling from Toronto, Canada, with at least 33 years experience in Africa under the aegis of the United Nations and USAID in post-conflict development in terms of governance infrastructure. Reading your paper, and I'm not an economist, I pride myself on being a lawyer with an epistemological background, so I know what I don't know, and I'm very confident in my lacking of knowledge. And if I could make one small suggestion, and this is based on my dealings with the IMF and other international monetary institutions in terms of what I term as atavistic bias. And I would encourage you to look at through the lens of Frantz Fanon, who spoke or wrote quite eloquently in terms of colonialism, post-colonialism, and the absolute profound, fundamental disregard we in the West have conducted ourselves in terms of other nation states in the ethos of assisting, which was not necessarily assistance. It's the equivalent of your crack dealer providing you with crack at a slightly lower cost, knowing that you will become addicted and sell your soul metaphorically to gain more of this particular substance. I realize this is somewhat beyond the ambit, but I believe it has currency because I've witnessed this. For the past 5 years, I've been in Congo, and I'll be returning back shortly. And in terms of what I call the deprivation, and when you see these people coming in knowing everything perceived, and I will demur at this point because passion is important, but I like to structure my passion within a basis of sound logic. And as I said, I found part of your paper very interesting, and I'm still staring over the grass because I will admit that's a weakness of mine. But I enjoyed the conversation, and for that, I thank you.
Thank you, Monte.
Yes, thank you. I will take a look at Fanon and post-colonialism.
Okay, well, any last reactions from you, Sarai, before we bring this to a close?
No, I don't think I have any final substantive comments. I just, again, want to say thank you for all of these really, really helpful and constructive comments. I think, as you mentioned, Robin, I have some choices to make, but I think now I have a good sense of what I could do with the paper. So this has been exactly what I was hoping for, really. So thank you all.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your work with the APCG online colloquium, and thank you, Robin and Thomas, for providing the feedback for Sarai's work, and for all of you for joining us, taking the time to read the paper and making the APCG online colloquium thrive in this sense. So thank you all, and look out again for our next colloquium. We will be sending out ads very soon for you to join us again next time. So you have a nice afternoon or nice morning wherever you are, and see you next time. Bye-bye. Bye, Thomas. Bye, Robin.
Thanks, George.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.